welcome back for another edition of Designed with Nicole. Today we are going to make these watercolor blocked cards. So the idea for this card actually comes from my daughter Addison, who was just fooling around with some extra washi tape in my craft area and was making these really cool kind of artistic graphic designs here. And so I thought that would make a really cool base for a card. So I grabbed some washi tape and some different watercolor-like elements, and that's what we're going to do today. So as you can see, I have a base here that's watercolor cardstock. I'm using that because I'm going to be adding water to the project and I don't want to use plain cardstock because that will warp. And I have some leftover washi tape here and some distress ink. These I've just chosen some autumn colors, so I believe I have used wild honey, spiced marmalade, mustard seed, I believe, and old paper. And I'm just going to rub those in different sections of the graphic pattern here, alternating the colors. Just rubbing that in, kind of getting all the color loaded into those little areas and fill up the base of the card. I am going to leave one space there in the middle open. That's where I'm planning to put my sentiment a little bit later. But for now I want to have the rest of those squares and triangles all filled up with the different colors of distress ink. This would be really cool in like jewel tones or even in soft pastels, but because it's fall, we're going to go with some fall colors. So I'm just going to get the last of this distress ink on here now and fill up some of the areas where I kind of went over with a baby wipe. So I'm just going to fill in this bottom orange area, just get that all filled up. And now I want to take away some of the color. I want to add like a bit of a mottled watercolor look. So I'm going to go ahead with my water brush here and just splatter on, as you can see, a bunch of water. Not going too crazy, just tiny little droplets. You let it sit for a minute or two, and then you can go in with a paper towel and just dab it away. It's going to lift off some of that color because it's distress ink. And if you need to go back in again, you can do the same thing over and over. So once you're happy with the amount of the splatters that you have, you can just remove your washi tape, and there's the base of your card. Just going to clean up my card front a little where I went over top of it with distress ink with a baby wipe, and now I'm going to just get to embellishing. So I kind of like that open area for my sentiment, but I actually feel like at this point it's a little bit too plain. I wanted to add some of that same splatter effect into the middle part there, so I grabbed this stamp set I have from Stampin' Up, and I'm just going to go ahead and kind of reverse the splatters. This time I'm going to go a little bit darker and use that same old paper distress ink, and I'm just going to use that to stamp the kind of lighter green splatter onto the open part of my card front. And now I decided that I wanted to add an embellishment, and I hadn't really thought what I want to put, so I always have a bowl of extra die cuts that I've cut for my digital die cut machine, and so I grabbed this double bit butterfly here that I have from another project, and I'm just going to add that together with some foam adhesive and a staple, and that'll look really nice on the front of this card. I'm going to stamp my sentiment with some brown ink, and then I'm going to figure out the placement of this butterfly. You can use a glue dot to stick that in place really easily, and that won't go anywhere. And now I want to try to think of something else to kind of jazz it up. I feel like it's nice, but I need to add a little bit more texture. So this is where my sewing machine comes in handy. I can just add a few little stitches along those grid lines there. Doesn't add a lot of color, but it adds a lot of texture, and that just adds a little bit of interest to the card. And sewing is fairly, frugal. It's a nice effect on your card. Gives that nice homemade look. Alright, so let's put that butterfly back on. I'm going to add a little bit more foam adhesive just to get those wings just popped a little bit more. I am going to trim it down because it's going to go on that craft cardstock base. And then I decided that I wanted to add some buttons to the center of the flowers to give it a bit of a body. So I've just dug through my button container that I have, and I'm just sewing those in place. You can also sew these separately and then add a glue dot to stick them to the center of the butterfly if you'd like. But I don't mind sewing right through the project. It actually it adheres it quite nicely that way. You just have to have a little bit of patience. So that's that card. So now we're going to go on to card number 2. Same thing, I'm going to use some more watercolor paper for this one. And I'm going to create another grid. This craft mat I have here from Scrapbook and Cards Today, it's one that you can use at one of the events we have, which are called Crop and Create. And it has tiny little dots all along the base of it. So I'm able to line up this washi tape really evenly. That's why I'm not using a ruler or anything. So I'm kind of lucky in that respect. But you can make your design however you'd like. I kind of want this to be a little bit more of like a an Art Deco kind of theme on the bottom. And this time, instead of using Distress ink, I am going to use some watercolor paint. So I'm going to grab my jar of water, and these are some Primo watercolor paints, and I'm just going to go ahead and slather the watercolor paint on. I'm really not a big watercolor expert. The one thing I can tell you is less is more. You can always add more in after. And the paper towel is my friend, so whenever I think I've kind of overdone it and added too much paint, feel free to dab it off. As soon as you get it on there, you can always add more after. What I'm doing with this square is I've actually added the water first. As you can see here, you add on the water, because it's watercolor paper, it can handle that. And then you can just tap in some color, little tiny dots of color, and it will blend really nicely itself. The water will almost do the blending for you. And in that way you can kind of load up paint in certain areas and leave it alone in others to kind of get a darker and a lighter effect. So I do that here with the navy. I added a light wash, as you can see, and I went back in along the top and then added a little bit darker just along the top. I'm using a water brush by Vicki Boutin, and it's really great because you can press the water spout on the side and add more water, so when your watercolor paint is there and it's mixing, you can dilute it a little bit so it won't be quite as strong. So just keep on going, filling in your rectangles and squares and triangles, whatever pattern you create, until you're happy with the result. You do need to let it sit for a few minutes. I'm not very patient, but I find with watercolor paints you really have to be a little patient. You kind of have to wait. Mine was drying pretty quick. Obviously this video is sped up a little bit. So once you're happy with the results, if you want to use a heat gun, you can do that, but be very careful you don't burn your paper, and do it very, very lightly. Patience is really better when it comes to watercolor paint. So remove your strips of paper, washi tape, and then I'm going to go ahead and finish off this card. So I have this really itty bitty greeting stamp set by Stampin' Up, and so I'm going to put many thanks all along this top corner here of the card. And I have some pretty die cut leaves I had kind of hanging around my craft desk that I want to use for this project, and I wanted to tie some twine on. I thought that would be a really nice kind of autumn texture to add to the front of this card. So I'm going to tie a little bit of this natural twine to the card, tie in a little bow onto the side, and then just trim that away once I get it secured in place. Alright, so now I want to kind of get some of those leaves on there. So I have these die cut leaves from an old paper pad I had from Basic Gray. They're really great fall colors, and I have 3 different leaves here. This is a die from Gina K Designs. And I'm just going to add some foam adhesive behind the petals, I guess you could call it, of the leaf. You call them petals. And so then I'm going to add these onto my card front. Just kind of tuck those in there. And then I thought that looks kind of plain with many thanks, so I decided to go back with my brown ink again and just really randomly, as you can see, stamping the many thanks over and over and over again. I'm not lining anything up. I'm going very fast. I want it to kind of look a little kind of planned, messy, I guess you could say. So I'm just letting some of them overlap, leaving some of them the way they are, and really the more imperfectly you make it, it will be perfect. I'm just going to tuck one last leaf in there, and then I decided to grab my watercolor paints out again. I wanted a bit more of a darker overall texture to both of these cards, so I'm just splattering a little bit of dark brown with my water brush pen that I've tapped just like I did on the very first card to get those water splatters. That's just a nice little finishing touch to finish off both those cards. Let's go back to the first card, and here's how that one turned out. You can see that splatter effect on the Distress ink, and I really love the grid lines. It's just a simple way to kind of add a little bit of a break on the front of the card base. I love how this one turned out. Super soft, super pretty, super easy too. The second one, I think, is my favorite card. I really love that kind of bold bottom that's color blocked off with the top with the many thanks over and over and over again. A really great fall theme too, the color palette, and I can totally see this doing on the whole base of a scrapbook layout too. So not just a card technique, definitely a paper project technique. I hope you've enjoyed this design with video. I'll see you guys again next month.